family program at Cardus really is here to conduct research, disseminate research, collate research on the Canadian family and on marriage in particular. The organizing principle around our research program is focused on family stability and helping Canadian families find that stability. We have a particular interest on marriage as a social institution. Canadian families are diverse, but we know from the research that marriage is probably the most resistant to instability. That is, it remains a fairly stable institution. So we think it's worth studying and figuring out more about why that is. So we do have a few resources on our website, obviously. One of the things you might find helpful, and one of the things we've really enjoyed putting together, is something called marriagemap.ca. We've taken research and data from StatCam, from studies that we've done, and we've tried to display them in easy to read graphs and charts, and you can just kind of scroll through the website and you can kind of find that information very quickly. So we hope it's a good, easy resource for you to use. In terms of like topics tonight, like family and flux, family formation, we've done some research on marriage. About a year and a half ago, we did a research project called For Love or Money. It was examining why Canadians say they get married, are going to get married, or definitely not going to marry the person that they're currently with. And it was a very revealing study. We looked at the general social survey for that. We find that lots of data gets collected on families in Canada, but it doesn't always get distributed, or the numbers don't always get crunched. And so part of our mission is to kind of find that data and make it available. We also did some work from the recent 2021 census, where we got special tabulations looking at living arrangements of children. What's the family structures that they're living in, and how has that changed over time? That one's called Canadian Children at Home. And one of the big projects that we've been working on over the last year, and it's ongoing, we did a novel survey of Canadian women on their fertility intentions and their desires, basically asking how many children do you want to have? Do you think you're going to have those children? What are the impediments for reaching those desires? We found that women are not having as many children as they say that they want to. And so we're exploring why that might be the case according to those survey respondents. So she's not having a baby is sort of the big report. It was the first report that we put out. We've also put out a second report just a few weeks ago looking at the influence of religion on fertility decisions. And then coming this fall, we'll have a report that's looking at things like how much does concern about climate change, overpopulation, and other just domestic issues, is that really having an effect on fertility decisions? We certainly see a lot about it in the news, but we wanted to try to understand that dynamic and just measure how much that is a factor in fertility decisions. We do a bunch of policy work as well. We've done a lot of work on the daycare file. That's been a big issue at the federal level here in Canada, if you're aware of that. And we have recently put out a framework paper we're calling the Federal Family Formation Framework. It's where we kind of lay out the principles and the things that we think are important to consider in creating family policy. And then we lay out a little bit of a framework of some issues that we think would be helpful for the federal level of government to address in terms of helping families make it easier for them to form the families that they desire. So those are some of the projects that we have on the go and are recently published, and I invite you to check our website out. I am quite pleased to introduce our guest from Washington, DC tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce Chris Bullivant, who's joining us via Zoom. Will be up on the screen in a second. Chris leads the Social Capital Campaign in the Washington, DC area. I first encountered Chris probably around 2008 or so at a conference on poverty. At that time, he was part of a UK think tank called the Centre for Social Justice, which was founded by the former Conservative Party leader, Ian Duncan Smith. The work of CSJ informed the Cameron government's approach to policy or to poverty and poverty reduction. And Chris has also worked at a think tank called UK 2020, and he's helped establish the online magazine Unheard. Maybe some of you have read Unheard. He has a master's in political sociology from the London School of Economics and a bachelor in political science from the University of London. Chris, welcome.
Hi there, it's great to join you all.
Thank you. Well, thanks for joining us tonight, Chris. The challenge, I think, with talking about family policy is that we all have families or come from families, and so it's very, very personal, right? So we all have a personal intake on this. It was the Canadian political scientist, and I've quoted her several times on this quote, Lydia Miljan, that says, family policy touches on the most deeply cherished and least questioned beliefs. And so it is a challenge to navigate, but it's a challenge that's worth navigating together. And so I do appreciate the direction that the Social Capital campaign has been taking. And I want to start by asking you, when you, the name of your organization's Social Capital, what do you mean by social capital? How do you define that? And then maybe what is the Social Capital campaign? What do you guys do?
Yeah, great. I'd love to explain that. Well, we took our lead from Senator Mike Lee, who was the chair of the Joint Economic Committee in Senate, who had created the Social Capital Project. What he tried to do, what they have been very effective at doing, is communicating some of these sensitive areas in a sort of economic language, talking about social capital as the rich network of relationships that people enjoy to varying degrees, varying levels of wealth of those relationships, and the sort of economic impact of those relationships being in place or not being in place, and the sort of fluctuation of the supply of that social capital across the United States. So we have shamelessly stolen their framework, their 5 focus areas that look at social capital, the institutions that create it, and how it's built, 5 different areas in order to have a focus on those relationships. In other words, these are relationships that take place outside of the role of the relationship between the individual and the state. So the project's a bit of a strange one, because we're talking about what can the federal government do in the US to help build social capital, recognizing that actually a federal government cannot build social capital, but it can do a really good job of destroying it or making sure that it's never built in the first place. So a lot of what we're talking about is policies that can be put into place to make sure that it's working in the grain of how social capital, those rich network of relationships around us, from childhood and family, and then our personal relationships throughout the life course, and then our professional relationships, how those, and then those relationships and associations that we have in our neighborhoods, how we can build those.
Great. So in terms of social capital, I guess I would be incorrect to think that we're thinking about social capital because of its relationship to financial capital, that it's a means to financial capital. It's something that's a bit more than that. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right. I think, I mean, politicians, I guess, are good at measuring GDP and that sort of thing. But I think when it comes to these arguments about how to, I think that how to experience upward social mobility, on the left, or traditionally on the left, people have been quite concerned with, well, if you could just redistribute money, then you're going to be fine. Everyone will be completely sorted. And then those, I guess, on the right, and in a sort of similarly sort of extreme way, well, if you're poor because you're lazy, it's your fault. I think social capital goes quite a long way to explaining a lot of the mechanics behind upward social mobility, or not. And I don't know if this is a good opportunity to share the slide of the 4 quadrants, but that might be worth bringing up at this point. I think when we started out this campaign 18 months or so ago, I'd asked a number of DC policy think tank people who joined our advisory board to think about what are the challenges that you're dealing with in your policy area of expertise. So if you're dealing with family stability or family affordability or work, what are the challenges? Because I think it's quite easy to get your sense of what the challenge is fused with your solution. And sometimes it's just good just to take a step back. One of the things that became really clear to me was that we weren't being very clear about who we were trying to help. So yes, I came up with this illustration, which I'm sure has its limitations, but that explains on that axis that goes across, which I think is the x-axis, low capital on the left going through to high capital. So people with not much money through to people who have lots of money and other financial assets. But what I wanted to introduce into that sort of like equation is this y-axis that looks at social capital, the wealth that people have in the relationships that they have, going from low social capital to high social capital, with high social capital being something like you've got a stable married family, you have extended family, you're involved in a faith group, you have a fantastic neighborhood that's low in crime, and overall there's high levels of trust, and everyone's pretty confident in their community and in their society. Down at the bottom with low social capital, you're perhaps inheriting nothing but intergenerational dysfunction and poverty, and you're not seeing any relationships role modeled to you. It might be that a 2-week relationship is considered long-term in your neighborhood. But this X and Y suddenly creates a completely different complexion around what is happening when we're looking at the policies that we're wanting to deal with. Because those who have low social capital and low capital find themselves in a world of pain that is quite different to those in number 3 who've got high capital and high social capital. So I guess high capital, number 3 will be sort of typically like boomers who've got their house sorted, they've got their pension sorted, they've got their grandkids sorted, they're living the Canadian or American dream. Whereas in 2, those who have high social capital but lower capital are, I mean, here in the United States, I would wonder if that sort of roughly translates, again, this is all very loose, but just for illustration, to say a Hispanic immigrant who has extended family, has a faith community of some sort at the moment, but doesn't have a lot of money. They have a significantly more resources than someone who finds themselves with low social capital and low capital. It's easier to weather unemployment, it's easier to find jobs, it's easier to enjoy emotional resilience if you have higher social capital. Number 4, I don't know who that would be. I don't know if that's the Kardashians. Sorry if any of you Kardashian family are listening in. But I think when we're looking at the policies that we're wanting to address, we're wanting to make sure that we're looking at all 4. I often think that number 4 are the ones that inform too much policy, to be honest, but we're looking at all 4 of those, recognizing that solutions for each will have ramifications for the other. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. Bear that in mind as we chat a little bit longer.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. I found that helpful. I should just pause for a second. We are going to have some opportunity for you to pose some questions to Chris. So if you have questions, remember them or jot them down on your phone or whatever. And we'll, in a few minutes, have an opportunity to ask yourself some questions of Chris. So Chris, 2 aspects of the social capital campaign has focused on has been 1, family stability, which is something that's interest at Cardus, and also family affordability. So what are the challenges in terms of family stability that you're seeing in the US? And then what are maybe some of the recommendations that you're making or the things that you're proposing from the social capital campaign in terms of family stability?
Yeah, so I definitely think that the heart of social capital creation is the family. That really is the main factory that produces social capital, those first relationships that you experience in your childhood. And so it is important that there is family stability. And I think Raj Chetty, and I'm sure you would have cited his research too, observes how those neighborhoods that have higher rates of stable families oriented around marriage are experience greater upward social mobility of those living in their neighborhoods. And it's also, I think, one of the largest predicators of whether a neighborhood is going to be violent or not. So family stability for us is a concern as much as it is an engine of, so it is the principal form of creating social capital, those private, individual relationships that role model, I think this is totally critical, that role model relationships to other people. Ideally, those are healthy, relationships, and a healthy manufacture of social capital in that way. And so I think what we have seen in the United States, and Brad Wilcox authored our paper there, is something of a marriage divide that increasingly, and this was not the case in the 1970s, but increasingly marriage is a preserve of the upper middle class and the wealthy, of the affluent. So amongst 18 to 55-year-olds, if I'm recalling correctly, amongst the affluent, the marriage rate is at 60%. But that plummets down to 40% once you're talking about the working class, and 20% when we're talking about the poor. So that marriage divide didn't exist beforehand, and that is creating a situation where the United States has the highest lone parent rate in the world, 1 in 4 children being in lone parents, and so not enjoying the benefits of stability that married families can generate. And then we're seeing with that, thinking about quadrant 1 there, and that earlier bit, those are low social capital and low capital, people who aren't necessarily having relationships role modeled to them in stable family, or also finding themselves unmarriageable. They don't have necessarily the traits from an emotional intelligence point of view, but they're also not sort of necessarily engaged in the labor force. So I think I think when we're thinking about marriage, I think we are attuned to the idea of an elite hypocrisy that would say diversity matters about how family is done. They will talk left, but they end up in their own private lives walking right and enjoying the benefits of stable family marriage themselves, and being able to pass that on to their children. So that I think the concern there is that if there is a divide now, that could become further entrenched, only adding to polarization.
And we've certainly seen that same trend happening in the UK, and evidence of that in Canada as well. So
pretty bleak.
Yeah.
And then I think on family affordability, I think the challenges there have been interesting to consider, because there are certainly those think tank scholars who think that there is not an affordability problem. I mean, there are those obviously that talk about the price of TVs has come down since the 1950s, and so that's great. We're obviously experiencing inflation on a whole load of other consumer issues at the minute, but I think when it comes to the family affordability issue, and if you chose a state college rather than a private college, then you might be able to afford it. There is clearly people feeling the pinch. I think this does relate to social capital. I think one of the things that is making family affordability more pressured is is the demise of the village that surround parents raising of children. So there was that book Hillary Clinton wrote ages ago, "It Takes a Village to Raise a Child," working on that, a proverb, and people have taken that to mean you can have 25 different individuals raising a child from birth, which is not necessarily the case. But what you need is 25 people helping the parents not go completely crazy as they sort of like do family. So that I think because there's the demise of the village, there is a lack of, depending on what your postcode is going to be, there's a lack of other parents doing the same thing. If you're a stay-at-home parent, there isn't the community in the same way that there may have been in previous generations, and their extended families may be disintegrated somewhat, with people having moved around, or with just a higher prevalence of people going no contact with their parents due to sort of wanting healthier relationships and interrupting intergenerational transmission of trauma or anything like that. So I think it's the village that is in demise. And I think that's putting a real pinch on the sense of family affordability, because it means that people are being overexerted on their own emotional reserves, I think, when it comes to parenting. So I think that is some of the family affordability picture that is perhaps sometimes not wholly appreciated.
We're going to move to questions in a second, but I did want to ask you, because you've touched on it in terms of that village. You did a recent report on looking at early childhood, 0 to age 3. In that report, you used the framework of attachment theory and how important the family relationship is for family development. It's something that we've been interested in at Cardus, but it seems difficult to translate that to the public policy world. We don't see a lot of talk like that. So my question then is, when it comes to social capital, when it comes to attachment and the relationship between family and their children, really, what is the role of, you're working with the federal government, but what's the role of the federal government? What's the role of state governments? Is it that in the case where there's low social capital, can the state generate that? Or is it that they're trying to mitigate the loss of that, or something all completely different? What's sort of your take on the role of the state?
Yeah, so briefly on attachment theory, then what we are talking about is the theory that Bowlby, the British psychiatrist or psychoanalyst, came up with in the 20th century, and that Mary Ainsworth here in the United States developed further. But the idea that actually as mammals or as people made in the image of God, whichever one you prefer to go with, that people have an evolutionary imperative as mammals and as primates to connect for their brain formation after they have been born with their biological mother. That is just how we have been formed to be, so that the synaptic connections are being made at a crazy rate in those first 3 years of life are entirely formed in a relationship, and that is with a biological mother. So that is what we're talking about with attachment theory. That's the sort of main rule from which there are exceptions, but that's the main inconvenient truth that we're talking about. And I think the reason I've used it in the social capital campaign is because actually those very primitive, primal relationships that get formed at those early stages actually pattern all of our relationships. There's a youth mental health crisis in the United States that the US Surgeon General has pointed to, an increase in depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, the incapacity for people to cope with stress in their first year as freshmen at university has gone up, or the capacity has diminished over the years. And it's very likely that that is connected to those formative months and years, and how we at those foundational layers from where our attachment is made. So this is, as with all family policy, is completely in the private sphere, and in that sense there's absolutely nothing to do with the role of the federal government. But I think what we want to make sure is that what a federal or state, any state authority is doing is working in the grain of making sure that we are building social capital. So if you want to have healthy citizens or a viable democracy, our third definition of social capital, besides the one of early childhood and then the one through the life course, is the trust that is a mysterious byproduct of trust that is society-wide, that is built by social capital. So when you have people who have rich, trusting, loving relationships and have high yields of social capital, they are more trusting of the invisible the citizen they have never met, thousands of miles away on the other coast, in this sort of imagined community that might be Canada. You have a much greater sense of trust if you have a sense of much solid foundation, secure attachment yourself. So I think the idea is governments become quickly unable to work if you don't have citizens with sort of relatively high stocks of social capital. So it's in the interest of a government to make sure that they are working. Similarly, for those people who are like, oh, it's all about the free market. Well, again, if you want to have customers, unless you're in the pharmaceutical industry or in the sort of like rehab industry, you want to make sure that you've got customers who are reliable, repeat customers, and those are those with strong, stable family relationships, ideally centered in secure attachment from infancy. So I think it's not the role of the federal government to decide, but or to interfere, heaven forbid. But I think it is important that they are setting the context by which those things are able to happen. So we're looking at policies around paid family leave. One of the reasons for wanting to promote attachment theory is to see if actually we can't inform the market and investors and parents on the value of attachment, in order that there may be greater voluntary adoption of paid family leave policies, which are pretty scant here. I mean, shockingly scant. Apparently, this stat is so crazy, I can't even imagine it's true, but we have gone with it and published it. But apparently in this country, 1 in 4 women return to work just within 2 weeks of giving birth. That's because there's such little social welfare security net around it, especially for those who are on low income.
Thank you. I want to turn it over to you to ask questions of Chris. Monica has the microphone, so she's going to bring that so Chris can hear your question. Please formulate your question in the form of a question and keep it brief so that we can all get a chance to ask questions. Andrew.
Thank you so much, Chris. I was just wondering at the outset, you said that the federal government can't do very much to build social capital, but that it can break it down. And I was wondering if you would be able to give one practical example of a policy enacted that resulted in breaking down social capital.
Yeah, are we doing this one at a time? Yeah, gladly. I mean, I think, and I'm sure that Cardus will come across this too, but the marriage penalty is something that can break down social capital. So if you are providing any form of like welfare assistance to low-income families, so for example, you know, a young woman finds herself suddenly, you know, pregnant, and her and the partner decide that they want to get married in order to raise that child. But because of the income threshold that she is on, if she marries that individual, the father, in order to create a stable family life and in order to sort of increase the opportunities for that child, then she will find herself suddenly without those benefits or without her Medicaid access. So it's actually then more affordable, actually makes complete sense to not get married and to sort of like press on without, which then obviously leaves the father perhaps being around, but it'll be a less stable family formation. So in that sense, federal policy can interfere with the sort of natural creation of social capital, which we would want to see happening. So we've proposed that actually what you should do is just keep just double the threshold so that people aren't penalized for getting married. And that also applies in the tax codes as well.
Where does it happen that a mother goes to work 2 weeks after giving birth? I'll keep my child away from there.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is in the United States. So the United States is a complete outlier because it has the worst maternal mortality rates in some of the worst in the world. And yet, giving birth to a child is the second most expensive place on the planet. To have to do that is the United States after Japan. There are very few legal protections for people who are low income to be able to take any sort of paid leave. I mean, the number of people that are covered as employees with paid family leave is low here because it's entirely voluntary. There are a few states that mandate it, but even then I suspect that's only for public employees. It will be in janitorial, custodial and fast food and low skill, low income work, with very few legal protections about that happens. And I think some of it, I think people return to work after the 2 weeks in order to keep their job.
Chris, it seems to me that over the last number of years, as an observer from Canada, that discussions in the US, say on paid parental leave, even just on family policy in general, has shifted. It seems like it's finding its moment. Am I seeing that right? And what are your observations?
Yeah, I think that's right. So when we would have met with those discussions, sharing about different ways to address poverty and welfare and do family back in the day, as you mentioned at the outset, these conversations around paid family leave just could not have, I don't think just were not happening or would not have been happening in 2008 or 2010. And I know that, so that when I lived in DC at around that time, went back to London with my American wife, and then we came back with our American daughter. So I think there's some self-interest when it comes to this area around attachment and doing children being here. I've been very surprised in talking to scholars. I don't know what has happened in order to accomplish this, but yeah, there was a definite appetite, I think stronger than a flirtation, with the idea of some forms of paid family leave or a super child tax credit, but significantly upping the amount of cash that is available to families, or certainly low-income families, probably tied with some conditionality related to work. But to make sure that having a child, becoming pregnant isn't a financially catastrophic event, which it can be at the moment. Again, for those who have an abundance of social capital and capital, they're sort of like relatively secure, but this is definitely for those who are on the lower end. And I think the reason why some of this is important is that 1 in 3 children in the United States are Hispanic, who are way overrepresented in poverty statistics here. And when we think about that earlier thing with the quadrants, I think one of the concerns I have is that Hispanics are seeing the fastest divorce rate, the fastest decline in marriage rates. There's a huge growth in the cohabitation, and the fastest decline in church attendance. And yet there's also they are the strongest believing in the American dream. And anecdotally, I was chatting to someone who was saying that they're pastoring families, pastoring Latin American families and Hispanic families in Florida who are like working 3 jobs, which is leaving their own family completely gutted of capacity because basically nobody is looking after the kids at home. And I think that pushes someone from that quadrant where they've got high social capital and low social capital down into the one where there's low social capital and low capital. So I think we really want to make sure that we're seeing social capital and the institutions that create it really trumpeted so that people are able to sort of build their own social capital.
I don't know if there's any other questions. Renzo, you've got a question. I'll give you the last question.
Thank you. I had a question about the issue of attachment as it relates to adoption, but specifically open adoptions. So I get that adoption might be something that would be the best option available, but given that option and the issue of attachment, is an open adoption, which on the one hand gives a child the ability to have an attachment to the biological mother. On the other hand, I wonder, can it lead to some issues around confusion about family and everything like that? Is there any evidence, or do you have any thoughts about what would be the right path in that kind of a situation, given the issue of attachment?
Yeah, just to clarify, open adoption, that's where the information around the biological parents is made available to the adoptive parents and the child. Is that right?
I guess I mean something where the child actually has a relationship, an ongoing relationship with the biological mother specifically.
Yeah, I mean, well, there are a whole number of things that can interrupt the ideal gold standard of the biological mother. I mean, death in childbirth, sort of being run over by a bus. And then obviously adoption, or just the financial pressures. So that I think what we are looking at is the idea that I think Erica Commissar writes quite well about this in her book Being There, but she says that in the absence of the mother being able to perform that role, and the main thing is that there is someone who is available as a long-term, consistent, reliable, attuned primary caregiver. So that could, in that case, obviously be the adoptive parent. In the case that you're talking about, say with an open adoption where there's sort of contact, that wouldn't be too dissimilar to a sort of extended family. So she would say that that doesn't come without any sort of complication for the child. Whoever is that you're substituting the mother with, whatever happens doesn't come out as some sort of complication, but that is then the second best option to go for. So assuming that the adoptive family are providing that sort of like continuous and reliable, predictable, attuned care and nurture, then it wouldn't be disruptive having the biological parent involved in the same way. It's not disruptive to have grandma come along for a couple of hours to help out in the week, I would imagine.
Thanks. Certainly in Canada, from the limited work that we've been doing in adoption, it seems like open adoption is becoming it's becoming more normalized.
That's great. Yeah,
for sure. Well, Chris, I thank you so much for your time. I appreciate the work that you're doing with the Social Capital Campaign. I always find your reports stimulating and interesting to consider. So wish you all the best in your work, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks so much. Great to meet you guys, and enjoy the rest of your evening. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm gonna get us started again. As Peter John mentioned, I'm the other Andrea at Cardus. I think Monica said 2 Andreas, double the fun. So if we fail in that regard, you can ask her about that. Peter John and Andrea, I wanted to get sort of your initial responses to what Chris had to say. Did anything specific that he said like kind of stand out? Anything you kind of want to comment on before I launch into the other questions?
One thing did jump out. I think that it's worth further study of the 1 in 4 mothers going to work within 2 weeks of having a baby. And there's a policy response to that, but there's also a cultural milieu in which that's happening. And this is purely anecdotal, but that would be the reason why I want to study it more, is because I have American family. My sister-in-law works as a dental hygienist, and it was the dentist she works for who went back to work 3 days after giving birth, which set the tone for the office such that nobody felt welcome to take leave, even if it was allotted to them. So I think I just want to look at that more and see the interplay there between, because you can assume the dentist was of a high income and it wasn't a forced decision, for example. And then the policy, like I like Canadian family leave, the paid leave of a year or 18 months. I like it because it sets a tone for what you can and can't do. But that interplay would be worth looking at a little bit of the culture with the policy and the finances.
I think I appreciated his graphic that he put up, and just sort of understanding that social capital is part of financial capital, but it's also a separate thing, and that you can have deficit in one and be higher in the other. And they've done a lot of work with Hispanic community, and at the end there, he was sort of explaining some of the trends that he saw. I thought that was really, really interesting. I guess as the guy asking the questions, you get to ask the things that you're interested in. And so I was curious about the role of government in helping out families, in part because I think there is a role for the government to help families, to remove barriers to family formation, for instance. Governments do fund Statistics Canada and the research that happens there, and understanding what's happening in families. At the same time, I think there's a limited role, and I think there's a role to support families even financially, but at the same time, wouldn't it be a shame if you couldn't form a family in Canada without the help of a check from the government? I think that's not the kind of position that anybody wants to be in as well. So trying to find that balance and trying to understand what the role is of government, of community, of other social institutions. I think those are questions that really interest me. So I was interested in what Chris had to say about that.
Great, that's really helpful. You guys have set me up for the questions that I was going to ask you, even though I didn't share them with you. So we're going to start with the policy question. So it seems like the US example, like looking at the US in comparison to Canada, it seems like things are a little bit bleak out there. And so I think we have a tendency in Canada to feel kind of poorly about our own sort of policy situation. And so the question I want to ask you is, I mean, it seems to me that in terms of paid family leave, employment protection, the coverage of healthcare costs, Canada is, far and away ahead of the US. But would you say that in the work that you've done, if the Canadian family policy framework is conducive to the kinds of things that we study here, like family formation and growing younger families?
You want to go first? Or?
Sure. So from my perspective, I would say, yes, we do have some generous benefits for families and for young people starting out into families. The Canada Child Benefit is cash payment to families based on income. It's tax-free. That's a great thing. For families, our paid family leave is very enviable. I think there's things that we could do to enhance it and to get better uptake of family leave, especially among lower income Canadians. But my observation, I think, and this is not just unique to Canada, but family policy is not necessarily like foreign policy or other policy areas where there's maybe more coherence. It's often spread out between different departments, and then it's a bit of a hodgepodge of policy options that aren't always congruent. And so I think that's the place that I would start, is to think about something that's a little more congruent, more coherent in terms of the policies that we look at. And I think a good place to start too is looking at reducing barriers that would prevent young people from entering into family life. As far as the government can do that, there's a lot of cultural questions there as well. And again, as I said, I think there's a lot of opportunities to be collecting information and data on families as well that would be helpful in terms of making public policy decisions as well. So.
I would only, I think, remark that some of the trend lines are the same in spite of the differing policy environments. So that leads to interesting questions for further study, which a think tank must point to. We have other things we want to study. There's so much to study. But so fertility is pretty similar the globe over, right? In spite of Canada having generous leave, we still have a low fertility rate. There are marriage penalties in Canada. So I know that we used to campaign a bit on the policy level for family income splitting so that married couples could file their taxes as they budget as a family, so together, and that's not something that came to pass in Canada. So yeah, there's some comparisons to be made, and in other places they might not be, you know, it might not be as easy to compare them. So also in Canada, when you remove Quebec from a lot of our social statistics, it becomes even more interesting. So Canada as a whole has like a lot of different both policy environments and cultural milieus.
So I want to ask another specific question. So Chris was talking about attachment theory for kids between the ages of 0 to 3. When you think about attachment theory and its implication for Canadian public policy, especially I'm thinking of the daycare issue or the universal $10 a day kind of model. Yeah, what do you make of that? Do you think that the Canadian sort of, at least federally, is the move conducive to Chris's understanding of the importance of attachment theory? And yeah, what do you think what is the sort of underlying motivation of the way that the federal government here has approached this particular element of family policy?
Well, I could jump in if I could. Sure. First of all, as a Canadian, I'm morally obligated to tell you that Gordon Neufeld is a premier scholar of attachment, and he's Canadian, and he's situated in Vancouver, British Columbia. He's the author of Hold On to Your Kids. He always echoes in my mind. We've worked with him over the years. He's a very effective teacher for people in the education system struggling with all kinds of issues that might stem from attachment issues. So for example, bullying, he will give seminars on that. So it's not limited to the 0 to 3 age range, but he always echoes in the sense that when I interviewed him once, he said if we cared about developmental psychology for children, we would send kids to school late, not early. And what you see in the move towards the universal $10 a day childcare plan is a move of precisely the opposite, to send kids, quote unquote, to school early, not late. And so the overriding, you know, the reason behind doing that program may or may not be for the welfare of your family. There's a host of other reasons why we come to that policy position, but ultimately, it's hard for me, in considering, again, Neufeld's work, to see how it would nurture healthy attachment or create that culture where mothers in particular and parents in general had the ability to make the choices that they want to make for their families, because it's really hard to have a unique and nuanced approach to the care of 0 to 3-year-olds. And it's different, as I never tire of saying, from the school environment for older kids, precisely because of what Chris was talking about and what other scholars have talked about. So I don't know if you want to jump in at all, or.
Sure, yeah. So I think what the federal government has recognized is that paying for daycare is expensive. I personally have paid a lot of money over the years for daycare. But the program doesn't recognize, and what's not very good at it, is flexibility, and as choosing the types of daycare or the arrangements that you wanted. And so in my own experience, I used a whole raft of different types of care. I even reduced my hours at work at one time to care for my child at home. But this federal program just can't accommodate those choices. And so if parents want to make different choices than what the system is sort of pointing towards, they don't really receive the benefit from that. One thing we have seen in terms of, I can't remember which country the study was done in, but there was a very different, I think it might have been Denmark, but there was a shift in daycare policy in which I think it was a country that provided benefits, cash benefits for young families, but also daycare. And it really switched its model towards daycare. And when the government was doing its own survey, it found that that decision was really kind of enculturating parents towards that program so that they felt like that was a necessary to do that program for the development of their children. And even in the language of our own program here in Canada, Best Start for Children in Life, we're sort of communicating something that isn't necessarily backed up. It may be a great start for some kids, but not all kids. Yeah, so I think overall, because it doesn't have that flexibility, it doesn't give parents the opportunity to choose the types of care that they want or desire for their kids. And so it really does limit the options when we're starting to think about what's best for my family, what's best for my child, what's best for our particular need.
Okay, so I want to switch to some more of the cultural questions. So I'm going to read the Cardus's working definition of marriage, which I like to quote at people, even though they don't ask me. So I'm going to quote it at you now. So the Cardus working definition of marriage is that marriage is a key institution that integrates sex, parenthood, economic cooperation, and emotional intimacy into a permanent union. This definition is very familiar to Peter, John, and Andrea because they wrote it.
I'm like scribbling notes, like, what was that again?
We in fact stole it. I should be honest. We in fact
Actually, it's a
quiz.
But I guess like when I was kind of reading this definition, so if you're a nerd like me, I think you would find that the institutional view is a compelling one. But I suspect it's not compelling to all young Canadians. And maybe there are people out there who subscribe to more of the soulmate view of marriage. You could hear my disdain as I said that. So I guess the question I want to ask you both as researchers in this field and also as people who are married and parents, is before we consider if marriage and family life is even attainable for young Canadians, is it even desirable? What are the benefits from what you've seen either personally or in your research, and you maybe make the case for marriage and family?
Yeah, defending family is my day job. I don't talk about my private life. It's too hard.
Ask Peter John to talk about his private life.
No, but yeah, where to start on that question? I feel like it's sad when young people think marriage is irrelevant. I feel like it's sad when they think it's nice to have, but not necessary. There's a lot of pressures to perform in our culture in ways that are not family oriented. And then for a lot of young women, as we surveyed them in the fertility survey, then by the end of their reproductive careers, they realize they would have wished for a family life that they don't have or can't have. So I think what I'm getting at is we're not really preparing. We don't put the full roster of options before young people and allow them to engage all of those things. I got married really late and sort of had the experience of working really hard and pursuing a career, which I truly enjoyed. And I feel like it was a meaningful part of my life. So there's nothing I'm apologizing for there. But at the time that I was doing that, I didn't know a single family. I had not really ever held a baby. I didn't know what it was like to have a family and also work. I never even considered those things. And if you asked me to hold a baby in those years, I would have backed away in sort of fear that I will break the child, or just like I didn't have the first sweet clue about what to do if I were to consider having a family or if I had a family. So I don't think that that is rich ground for a fulfilling life over the long term when we only ever preach about career success to young people, which was my experience. So yeah, came to that understanding of marriage and the importance of it a little bit later in life, and can just compare and contrast on that personal level.
I think I can attest to that because I think the first time I met you was maybe with my daughter is a little.
I backed away from your daughter.
Not on the tile floor.
Yeah, because it was a tile floor.
Yeah, so I think, as Andrea said, I think the perspective of when we do surveying on this, we find that Canadians generally think that marriage is nice, but not necessary. Now, there is lots of data that would suggest that people that are married tend to have better health outcomes. They tend to find illness earlier because maybe the wife makes the husband go to the doctor when he doesn't want to. I'm not saying that that sometimes happens, but there's various reasons. Men who are married tend to make more money, that sort of thing. So there tends to be these benefits that are linked with marriage. It could be that just the people who tend to make more money also are the people that tend to get married, or it could be that this is the effect of marriage. I'm looking at the data. I think there's both are at play, but there's definitely seems to be some benefits to marriage. What I think we've seen change is when my in-laws, for instance, got married, they were 19 and 20, they had nothing, they got married, they built this life together. I think what we're seeing now, rather than marriage being a foundation for which you build your life on, it's now more likely that you've got to get educated. You've got to try to get stable employment if you can, housing if you can, affordable housing, and then maybe even have kids or whatever. But then marriage is sort of this capstone that once you've accomplished the sort of prerequisites, now you can kind of get married. So that makes it more of an option for some people, and it makes it actually not an option for a slew of society, which is what Chris was talking about, where we're seeing this gap in terms of wealthier people tend to get married. They benefit from that, and those who don't, they're sort of left behind or feel like marriage is out of reach. So we certainly have that dynamic. And certainly things in culture have changed as well, right? We've seen a growth in common law relationships. Some end in marriage, some act like marriage, many do not. Many are just kind of temporary or good for now types of relationships. So we're certainly seeing a cultural change in family formation and just how important marriage is. So yeah, I think that gets at your question.
Yeah, so a stat that I have written down here is that in Canada in 1970, 91% of census families were married. And by 2016, that percentage had dropped to 66%. And so I want to dig in a little bit more into some of this like cultural shift. And I know like Andrea has done a lot of work in writing on this. You, Peter John, have thought about this a lot. I'm wondering if you can bring in some of the polling that we did around fertility, maybe on the one hand, and then on the other side, because we were polling Canadian women on their sort of fertility aspirations, but increasingly, and I think this has come up even more so this year, this idea around sort of like the crisis of men, issues around masculinity, or yeah, like this idea of extended adolescence, whether or not men are marriageable, that kind of thing. So I was wondering if you could talk maybe speak a little bit about both sides. I know we haven't done a lot of work on necessarily like the male view, at least in recent polling, but yeah, I was just wondering if you could maybe pull both of those things together, and what are the cultural shifts that you're noticing, and what implications is that having for then family formation?
The cultural shifts, just clarifying your question a little bit, pulling together the changing environment of men and their realities with the lowering of the marriage rate kind of thing.
It's like me asking all the questions that I want to ask at the same
In
time.
one.
So please answer whichever one you'd like. But yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I was picking up the book by Richard Reeves, and it's a book. What's the title? Do you remember? Anyways, Richard Reeves is the author, and he's a scholar who he's a centrist left, I'd say, and he's chosen to focus on like the plight of men. So I just started reading that, and he, at the beginning of it all, puts in all the stats of how men are doing in our society and the lower rates of graduation and attendance in graduation from high school, attendance in university, joblessness, not in the labor force. All these things come together to sort of, his point is there is a problem with men in our society and that it is long overdue to address it. It's just really interesting because we have gender-based analysis in the federal government here in Ottawa, and I assume other places as well. Richard Reeves is another Brit transplanted to the USA. But gender-based analysis is brought in almost exclusively to look at what female needs are, women's needs, right? And so now we have this lag where women are excelling in a number of different domains. I'm not making it into a competition. I could point out areas where women are struggling and need some help as well. But I wonder, like I always wonder about, we're getting it wrong in creating this competition, and we would probably do better to have a family-based analysis that examined policy and how it affects families. And instead how are women doing? Now okay, are they doing better? GBA is all the thing. And now now we have to go and turn to men and like fix the gap that is growing there. That partners with the marriage question, because the studies and the research show that women essentially, in spite of all feminist progressive notions in our society, still want to marry up, to put it, you know, indelicately. And if there aren't men to marry who are doing better than them, then it will create an environment in which it's harder to find someone to partner with for a lifetime. So I don't know if that brings together some aspects of your questions, but those are some thoughts that sprung to mind.
So I think on men, I'm still considering this and thinking about this, and I'd actually would be interested in what others have to say and think about it too. I have a quote on my bulletin board. It's from a French priest who is talking about his dismay that, that the men here are seeing they are just dating their girlfriends and they have no intention of ever marrying these girls. They're just kind of carrying on, just kind of living their life. They're not doing the sort of things they need to be doing to preparing themselves for married life. And he is in dismay. And I love the quote because it's from 1937. I think there's, you know, the crisis of men is sort of men is kind of a broad group to say that there's a crisis among them. But to some degree, like societies have always had challenges with like young men sort of wandering around. They tend to form gangs and turn to violence, right? So we put them in armies, we give them some discipline, whatever. It's been a civilized kind of questions, and that's also civilizations have kind of dealt with. At the same time, I think to like try to make broad statements about men is as challenging as it would be to make broad statements about women. But I think we have seen in the U.S. at least, Nick Eberstadt at AEI in the U.S. has done a good job of showing that there is a bit of a crisis of men who are able-bodied but out of the workforce. And part of that is maybe changes in the economy and moving to more a knowledge-based economy, and then sort of the loss of skills and skilled trades and stuff like that. At the same time, we have a crisis in skilled trades that's happening. So I'm not sure I fully understand what is transpiring there. A neighbor of mine who is a HVAC guy came and fixed my furnace, and he's telling me that like a big part of his business is actually subcontracting for another guy, because that guy has two young guys that work for him, but they're so inconsistent in showing up to work that they have to hire my friend to come and like, so he at least has one dependable guy. And so he makes his vacation money basically working for this other guy because he's reliable. He's like, I can't find anybody that will show up to work for me consistently, so I just do this stuff myself. And so that to me indicates there's some sort of crisis, something is being missed, and maybe Chris is onto something about social capital. Maybe there's something missing in those particular young guys' lives that that's just not translating. At the same time, I was reading Sean Spear over the weekend, who was saying we have the same kind of crisis but happening in universities where we have guys are getting lots of education and then they're just not like, they're sort of stalling out after that. So I'm not really sure what's going on there. I could give an anecdote of my brother-in-law who runs an engineering department. He hires like entry-level engineers and they all have master's degrees. Like that's the bottom line. So you have to get that level of education even to get considered for this bottom line job. So I think economically things are changing and maybe men just have not adapted or whatever, but certainly something is shifting. I'm not quite sure what it is or I'm still thinking about that, but there definitely seems to be part of the equation of what's happening and why it's more difficult to get to where we're at.
No, I'm good.
I was listening to a Richard Reeves podcast today because I'm not as advanced as Andrea and not reading the book. But he was saying that the way that our education policy is structured is biased against men and allows boys and girls to allows girls to succeed more easily. But when women go into the labor force, our labor policies tend to be biased against women and allow for sort of men to succeed career-wise more easily. So I thought that was an interesting sort of summary of the kind of two ways in which.
That's also in the book.
Oh, see, I skipped I got the spark notes.
Okay, thanks.
Also, I think it sounds like I need to get into the HVAC business, but that's okay. That's for time.
Yeah.
There's a lot of options for me out there. I feel like we still have a little bit of time. Monica says 10 minutes. Okay. Could we talk more about the fertility polling? I think that's just one of the bigger projects that we've done this year has a lot of really interesting results. And so I think interesting things around what we asked were, what were women's fertility desires? How did this impact their family planning? And then what impacts did it have generally on their life satisfaction, which I think is a question that isn't often asked. So yeah, I was wondering if you could tell us more about that.
Yeah, so I thought that was a really interesting study, and I appreciated that we asked women what they wanted, and I also appreciated that we phrased it positively. So 50% of women would like to have more children than they have at the end of their reproductive careers. You can see other articles that will say 50% of women, like the opposite type of phrasing, they're not having kids or something like that. I like the hopeful slant. It's a little bit, there's a little bit of a twinge of sadness associated with that, but it's not all that often. It hasn't happened in Canada that people have asked women, a pollster has asked women how they feel about their fertility desires. So we're at an all-time low, as so many nations across the globe are, of a fertility rate of 1.4 children per woman. The replacement rate is 2.1 children per woman. And so there's a huge gap there. There's an interesting documentary available on YouTube, at least part of it's available on YouTube, called The Birth Gap, and it identifies all the reasons why that's a problem. So some people think it's not a problem. This is a result of women's independence and choices, and then further, there will not be ramifications to it. Our survey showed it's not the result of women's choices, but rather of obstacles or barriers in their way. So they would have wished to have more children. I think the intent is somewhere closer to 2. And then, of course, it's only fulfilled at 1.4 in practical reality. The reasons given for that, we asked women who said they want to have children why they wouldn't in the next 2 years to get at reasons for not having kids. I think the number one reason was wanting to grow as a person. I wish I had the study in front of me. Wanting to grow as a person was the top reason. And then after that were money, earning more money, growing in career, and a desire for leisure. And I'm missing the other one in the top 5. But there's a lot to unpack there about cultural life scripts and what it means to live the good life. The big question for me is why so many women today don't consider having a family to be part of what would allow them to grow as a person. And it's really hard to communicate why that might be part of it, what it means to grow as a person professionally, spiritually, and in emotional ways as well. So that's kind of the top line on those survey results. And I am, I think, pretty proud of Cardus for taking that on. And I do think it's touched a nerve, and we're hitting on something like the survey is accurate, if I could put it that way, because you get women coming and saying that, and people talking about it in ways that are productive. So I don't know if you want to mention anything.
Yeah, I think so. Financial concerns were definitely part of the survey, part of top reasons, but they weren't the top reason. I think that surprised me a little bit. Certainly housing is incredibly expensive, rent is expensive. We're going to have to reckon with that for families and for the sake of fertility and family formation. At the same time, I think there's a bit of enculturation that suggests you have to have a certain amount of things before you can start a family or form a family that I'm not sure is quite accurate, or and maybe it's a cultural notion that could be challenged a little bit. But I certainly was surprised at the role that economics does play. It's a factor, but some of the things like personal development were higher, and it's really hard. I think if I was looking at pre-kids me to try to communicate to my current self to communicate to pre-kids me like sort of the benefits of having kids and like why that would change your life in a good way and that kind of thing. And I think we sometimes communicate these things are incompatible, and maybe that's where public policy has a chance to step in, where we have generous leave, and we have other more family-friendly kind of work environments, that sorts of things. And I think also community places that champion like having kids and that. Faith communities are part of that, but as we secularize, right, I think there's a bit of a loss of supportive communities, both that are championing the value of children and saying babies are good, but also offering a community that's supportive. And I think Chris got into that, where we're sort of that loss of the village, right? Where, yeah, this is relationships from that kind of help just isn't as readily available as it used to be.
I also think there's a little bit of a vicious circle. As we have fewer kids, we truly do have workplaces that are less family friendly, because you have to accommodate fewer families. And so then you have fewer families and you see fewer babies and you end up in your late 30s never having held a baby, that kind of thing. So yeah.
I think one of the responses from the survey was this perception that parenting was very intensive.
Oh yeah.
I think that was
You've read the study. Good.
I'm a big fan of your stuff. Yeah. But I think that points to this idea around the lack of community, or the lack of.
And you know where else there's a vicious circle is on that very key point of intensive parenting. Because if you only have one child, it is by nature more intense than if I had to divide. I have one kid. If I had to divide my attention between a couple of kids, it would become less intense. So it's kind of interesting how there's a circle, and it, you know, it's hard to track what starts what, but it's just.
Yeah, I think like the concept of intensive parenting is sort of that pressure to make sure like your kid succeeds and doing everything humanly possible. So it ends up being like a huge investment in the extracurriculars and that sort of thing, which, you know, there can be positives to extracurriculars, but it can also, it gives this perception that parenting is a lot harder and a lot more expensive than it necessarily needs to be. And you know, if we can communicate that parenting is not as hard as you maybe think it is, or that you don't necessarily have to have your kid in hockey every night a week for them to be successful. They're not going to go to the NHL anyway. So like,
If I
you
could
can't really say that, but
point to attachment again, I think it's Gordon Neufeld who says that parenting today has become more about what you do for your kids versus who you are to your kids. And that speaks a little bit to the intensive nature of it. Like, I have to take my child to all these lessons to have them be successful, get them in the right preschool so that they end up at Harvard, versus who you are to your kids in the relationship as a presence in their lives. I think that's an interesting, I think I had never thought of it in that way. And it actually takes a lot of pressure off if you think about your key role in the relationship, and that you are parenting in a good way simply by being there, in a way, which is the title of the Erica Commissar book, Being There, that Chris had mentioned, Chris of the screen. The role of mothers in the first 3 years is critically important, this kind of thing, but it's not about what you're doing, rather that you be more.
Monica's telling me that it's time, but I really want to ask my last question. So in 60 seconds or less each, I want to return to the main question of this event. Is family life out of reach for the next generation? Yes or no? 60 seconds each.
No. A bid for no.
yeah, I would say it's not out of reach, but there's certainly some pretty unique pressures for this current generation that we need to be serious about and take serious. And I think there's a policy piece to that, but I think there's also like a cultural messaging piece to that.
Great. Question time. I think we're going to do like 1 or 2 questions at a time, just so that we can be more efficient if there's more than one question. So raise your hand and Monica will run the mic. Amanda?
Hey, good to hear your guys' perspectives. I was kind of struck by a point that the last gentleman on the screen from DC made, that I think you guys echoed too. So the idea that attachment theory could explain the lack of trust in institutions seems like a bit of a leap, like, I don't know if that's been, researched. I know that from my own just researching attachment theory and religion, that, it can affect your tendency to believe in a higher power. So I could see it, maybe cause to think that. Is there any research behind that, or like what was that based on, this notion you could extend the idea of, like, if you don't have a good relationship with your mom, you might not trust the government? Like, is that where's that coming from?
We'll let it ferment. The question.
Given that most government policies currently aim at financial capital, right? Family child benefit, daycare, but don't focus at social capital, enhancing the village, enhancing the support network. Thinking about what are the kind of policies that could be instituted, there has been a decentralization of nonprofit organizations vis-a-vis churches and their pro-social component. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on what kind of social capital policies, programs, or systems can be run even without the aid of the government.
So for the first part, how is it that a lack of attachment would lead to a lack of trust in institutions? I think the Gordon Neufeld book on Hold On to Your Kids, it's called Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers, might speak a little bit to that. Insecurely attached kids relying more on a peer group for edification and less on parental role models for whatever reason leads to what he calls an immature culture, which he says we already have. And he speaks to that in a European context as well. So it's not limited to North America. But if you can extrapolate a little bit from what it means to be immature and take that into a cultural milieu and a little bit bigger, you might begin to see ramifications of what we notice as immaturity in small children as manifesting in the world. And the other author I'd point to on that concept to further flesh it out and explore it and see if it makes sense would be Mary Eberstadt. And she wrote a book with a really provocative title. It's called Primal Screams, and it's about identity politics. And it's actually about being kind to some of the millennial generation and younger who get made fun of for being snowflakes. But she points to a real loss in their lives of family, that they don't have stability in their family lives. And then as a result, they might turn to more extreme forms of politics and identity politics and belonging in a group in unhealthy ways. And we have seen, I think, a lot of that, particularly in the United States. So I don't know where that leads for like the trust barometer, but I think there's some pointers there that might help that, like flesh that out a bit. And I'm inclined to think it's perfectly possible that we can lose trust in bigger institutions through a lack of attachment with our own families and a lack of understanding where we're from. And that incidentally doesn't have to be exclusively through family breakdown. It can be through immigration and not knowing where your parents are from because they were compelled to leave and couldn't go back or what have you. So it certainly isn't a judgmental statement, and it's not limited to family breakdown.
I think on the just sort of the social capital and what can community do. I think it's interesting, like, I think going back for a few decades now, we've seen sort of successful outcomes of, and this is probably government funded, but like home nurse visits where we have a nurse going into the home very early on, even sometimes before the child is born, and working with moms one-on-one. And there seems to be some positives for that. But I definitely see there's room for community organizations to be supporting the families. There's a neat little initiative I encountered a few years ago. It was called Marital First Responders. And the same idea that you might train somebody in first aid. This idea was, it was a psychologist training everyday people and just how to kind of catch people that were in relationship trouble. So relatives or whatever, friends or whatever, you go to a coffee with a friend, they're telling you have trouble in their marriage. You would then have the tools to kind of navigate them and kind of catch them and then help direct them towards maybe professional help if professional help is needed for their marriage relationship, whatever. So I think there's just some neat innovative programs like that are happening, but definitely I think too, there's been numerous programs in terms of relationship education, financial education, that sort of thing. The trick is getting the people that are most in need of that, like into those programs or encouraging them to come. How you do that, I think is tricky, but I think there's probably some models out there that are working that are encouraging. Yeah.
If I could just jump in on Amanda's question. So I don't think Chris was able to fully explain kind of like his understanding of social capital, but I think that what he envisions is kind of like a 3-step thing. And so attachment theory for 0 to 3 and then throughout childhood is kind of like the first step. And then it's your social networks that enable you to thrive as an adult personally and professionally, which is kind of the next step. And then that leads into higher trust between citizens as bonds form. So I'm not really sure how he articulated it, but it wasn't like a direct correlation kind of thing. It was more like you're secure and well attached, and then it kind of progresses throughout your life.
You want to ask another? Yeah.
Yeah, just kind of circling back on the attachment thing. So there is a theologian and a psychologist in the States, a guy named Jim Wilder. I don't know if you've done any look into his research. He considers himself a neurotheologian as well. He's one of the, so he's kind of in this unique position that he kind of bridges the gaps of the physiological and the spiritual. And so he's done a lot of research and a lot of production of materials on attachment theory. And he says it extends well beyond the 0 to 3, but the 0 to 3 is the most critical window. Now, after the age of 3, what we see was spiritual formation and with faith formation and levels of trust, of health in relationships, and the tendency to be triggered into adversarial and aggressive behaviors is a result of poor levels of attachment. And so higher levels of attachment to our community of faith, to our families, to our loved ones, helps us have lower levels of aggression in society and culture, but also extensively greater ability to be emotionally resilient and engage in trust activities, which is also faith behaviors, pro-social governmental relationships, like things that are effective for relationships on a marital level even. So it was Jim Wilder is what I was mentioning. So I really appreciate that, because attachment, especially when we look at neuroplasticity, attachment continues to be kind of a lifelong brain rewiring thing. And so even now we're seeing people engaging in attachment training seminars to, in a sense, kind of repair the lack of attachment in their childhood. And so we're starting to see a lot more churches and faith-based organizations asking questions about how do we promote attachment and attunement as well in marriages. And so that kind of bounces back over to what you were talking about, Peter, about kind of marriage first responders and mentor moms, people in social capital, trying to build social capital in churches where they're supporting new moms from a retired mom in the congregation, that kind of thing. So speaking from a pastoral side.
Yeah, I know in I think it's the Diocese of Montreal, they've kind of shifting their marital sort of preparation and moving to more mentorship model rather than instructive model.
That's good.
Thank you so much for that. So my question is, as someone who is millennial, as well as going to someone probably Gen Z, they're probably thinking about marriage is so scary. We want to focus on career first. And then career is very important pieces of what determines them. And then they're being scared about the concept of getting into their family life and everything. So it's like, but we said it's very possible to achieve it for these things, for the government to making policy, those ones. Even government was saying the $10 childcare, but sometimes thinking about the housing crisis and everything is very expensive. It's very hard to reach. So what are some potential policies you can recommend it for the government? Probably that's one angle. And the second thing is probably because we know that there are lots of young people that were choosing actually abortion instead of actually keeping the baby and everything. That keeps actually the sense of Canadian, especially the rate is actually down for the fertility rate. I think that's the answer, but I'm not sure. But one thing is, because sometimes I ask some pregnancy care center, I used to working for them. So I'm just wondering, are there any ways they can probably potentially to educating the kids and to the Gen Zs and millennial to let them to see that the valuable things of the how family function is in the society. Thank you.
So if I was going to sort of summarize your question, there's some aspects of fear that your generation has. It's very scary to settle down and get married. And is there a policy recourse to help with that? Yeah, so on the fear factor, I think it has a lot to do with the culture. And then the policy environment would be secondary in my view, and Peter John can jump in if he disagrees, but the social capital aspect that Chris, if you were here for the first part that he was speaking about, the living in community, the normalization of family life. If you knew 10 families around you right now who were successfully navigating work and having a family, you might feel less scared about embarking on that yourself, but it's become a little bit of an anomaly, especially in urban environments. And so it becomes scarier, I think, without the community around us. So that's that crisis of social capital. Canada has a lot of strong policies, not every strong policy in place, but as we've talked about, there's that great maternity leave option that many people do take. There's the CCB, the Canada Child Benefit, which will, it's a joint liberal conservative nonpartisan thing to help parents. I tend to think we really have to work on the cultural side. And on the abortion question, I wasn't 100% sure what you were asking, but I'm grateful to you for bringing it up, because much to my chagrin, I learned from the demographer who did and designed our fertility survey that if you even ask about abortion in a fertility survey, too many people will check out of the survey and just stop answering the questions right away. So we didn't even touch on that in the fertility survey. We didn't ask about prior pregnancies or ended pregnancies. So I'm not sure I totally understood your question about abortion, but we didn't ask about it in the fertility survey because we couldn't.
It's sort of my impression that, or my belief, I guess, that marriage as a social institution needs the support of other social institutions to thrive. And I'm not sure, every time we do something on a study on marriage or look at data or whatever, we often have very few like policy recommendations. This is really not, it isn't more of a cultural issue, and I'm not sure we want the government absolutely telling you that you need to get married. Marriage is not for everybody. But certainly we do, I think there is room for culture. I think a big challenge is that if you've witnessed tragedy in your own family or a breakdown of marriage in your own family, then yes, your response is either going to be, I need to stay away from that, or I don't want to try to replicate that. So I think that fear is real. At the same time, I think we put a lot of pressure on marriage. We mentioned it earlier, this sort of companionate view of marriage. It's shifted over time where like the person I marry has to be they have to complete me, right? And I think this is just a really unrealistic expectation on marriage. This person is going to meet every need that I have. And I think that just makes marriage more daunting if that's sort of the approach that we're going into. And so I think we need to maybe have some more public conversations about what marriage is, what are the reasonable expectations about it, why do we get married, those sorts of things.
Join us in our effort to design a series of Hallmark cards that talk about how marriage is not about love, not exclusively about love. You're not my everything, but thanks for coming out. I think it's going to be really effective.
Build an institution with me.
Yeah, build an institution with me.
Any other questions? I see one more. We probably have room for another one, so if anyone, now is your chance.
You have a website, you publish studies, and you thought of putting out cards to promote.
Oh, that was a joke. Yeah.
So what else does Cardus do to encourage people to develop social capital?
To be clear, there's no cards. No. Well, the view of Cardus and the role of Cardus in this web of creating social capital is really on the research side and the information side. Nobody else in Canada tracks with the issues of family in the way that we do. And so it provides a data point for policymakers and researchers and politicians to have a leg to stand on if they want to promote some of these valuable institutions. So I think that's the main contribution. Not everybody can do everything. So
I think one of the most valuable things for me has been able to work alongside or to speak with people that are doing that sort of on the ground, boots on the ground kind of work. So whether it's working with people in community groups or meeting and speaking with people that are counseling people, it gives helps us better understand like what's happening on the ground. And then if we were able to kind of share some data or information about what's happening in Canadian families, it can also be beneficial for them.
the marriage map, yeah, it's publicly accessible. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so everything is available free on our website. Come to the family tab and you can scroll through.
Except
and
the
then
cards.
marriagemap.ca is just a general kind of a collecting point of all kinds of data.
We didn't plant those questions either. Here, let's tell you more about our important work.
Any last questions? One last go before I wrap it up. Go ahead.
Sure. Are there some countries, at least in the Western world, who have made some progress on the issue, who have managed to reverse or at least arrest the decline of marriage rates?
Yeah. I was actually reading up on, I thought somebody might ask about Hungary in the context of this discussion, because they've done this all-out assault on attempting to combat low marriage and low fertility rates, and they're handing out everything but the kitchen sink to people. If you have 4 children, you don't pay any income taxes. If you have 3 children, you essentially get the rough equivalent of what would be something like 80,000 US. Like not insubstantial amounts of money. It's dependent on your income and other factors, but it's just they're so the jury's still out is the short answer to your question on whether that's effective or successful. They did see an uptick in marriages, but then there was some commentary on like all the people who are going to get married are already married, and how will that go in the future? And then I think similarly, it's the jury is out on the fertility, although they did see an uptick. No one has ever seen a return to replacement thus far. Am I right? So they went from like really super low, like 1.3 to up to, I believe, I want to say 1.7, which is great. It's an improvement. It's a sort of, but then like, I'm not going to applaud that approach if I consider the nature of the policy environment in its total, you know, if you, like a lot of dictatorships can pull off a lot of things, but it doesn't mean we're going to implement them here. So I just consider that to be something interesting to track with. But on fertility, I do know nobody has reached replacement. And I don't think a lot of places have tried on marriage, which makes that example interesting to look at.
Yeah, I think on fertility, if I was to sum up the research, I think you can kind of tease up fertility rates, but again, not to replacement levels. And then, but trying to sustain the amount of funding that requires, the amount of spending is, countries have just not been able to do it, right?
Right.
And Hungary's like 10 million people, right?
It's not a huge
36
country.
million.
The demographer who did the fertility survey for us and designed it, his name's Lyman Stone, and he was on this podium doing a panel, and he had this obscure but fun example of a real uptick in fertility in
Georgia.
Was it Georgia? Yeah, and it was because
Country, not the state.
the patriarch, yeah, the country, not the state. It was because the religious patriarch in Georgia said something about how he would baptize every baby born personally, and that still held sway in that country because there was still enough religious sentiment, so everybody started having babies so they could be baptized. But his point was again a hopeful one, which is to not think there's nothing that can be done, and to not think that it will forever be as it is. And so I like his approach on that as well. So some things can happen and change that. Yeah.
I think we're going to wrap it up, but Andrea and Peter John will be around to answer all your questions after this with snacks. So Monica is going to.
Yes, I'm just going to talk about the snacks. And yes, thank you so much for coming out tonight, everyone. Let's give a round of applause to Andrea and Peter John.